Welcome back. As Kathy mentioned, I'm Tasha Keeney, one of ARK's autonomous technology and robotics analysts. And today I'm here with Adam Bree. Adam is CEO and co-founder of Skydio, a US drone manufacturer and a world leader in autonomous flight. He has over 2 decades of experience in the unmanned aerial system space. He was part of the award-winning project at MIT that pioneered autonomous flight. And Adam also co-founded Google's Project Wing. Thanks so much for joining us today, Adam.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So, I'd love to start off and just ask you, why did you start Skydio and what is Skydio trying to achieve?
So I grew up flying radio-controlled airplanes, which were kind of the predecessors to drones. So I took it way too seriously as a kid. I actually traveled all over the country, flying in aerobatic competitions. And that's really what got me interested in engineering. And then I was fortunate to be starting grad school at MIT around the time when you could essentially take RC airplanes and start to put computers and sensors on them and get them to do smart stuff. And I just got addicted to the challenge of trying to write software that could do things at or beyond the capabilities of the best human pilots in the world. So I kind of stopped trying to be a good radio control pilot myself and started focusing on writing software systems that could do a lot of the things that experts were capable of. That's where I met my co-founders, Abe and Matt. So we were working on this stuff at MIT mainly because it was interesting and challenging. This was kind of late 2000s period. And the motivation for starting Skydio was looking out and starting to see the opportunity for drones come into focus. 2013, 2014, people were starting to talk about all the amazing consumer possibilities and all the amazing industrial, commercial applications and opportunities. And we felt like all that stuff was really compelling, but that it wasn't really going to work the way that people wanted it to, unless you could trust the drone to fly itself. And it's stuff that we knew a lot about and loved working on from our background. So at the most basic level, that's what motivated us to start the company, is just feeling like there was enormous potential here in this industry. And there was kind of this key foundational piece that we knew a lot about and loved working on. And that's really what we're about today. So I think the story is largely the same, but we're actually starting to see these possibilities come to life with our customers. So at the end of last year, we launched Skydio 2, which from a consumer perspective is it's like a fully autonomous film crew. Like you can put the thing in the air, it follows people around, it avoids obstacles, it takes amazing video, and it kind of replicates. It's like you had an expert drone pilot out there with you, or you had a Hollywood film crew. All that capability is available to somebody to take with them for their adventures, hiking, biking, skiing, or just playing in a park with their kids. And we have customers generating all sorts of amazing video there now. And then on the kind of enterprise and government side of things, this has always been part of our vision, but that market has taken longer to mature. But we're seeing that really come into focus now as well. And we have we have customers doing all sorts of inspection mapping type tasks where you're making the world run more efficiently by keeping track of how infrastructure is running. So, for example, energy utilities inspecting their transmission towers, or departments of transportation inspecting bridges. And you're also keeping the operator safer. Like these are tasks that oftentimes getting these inspections requires really putting people at risk, and doing it with a drone, you can get better data and do it in a safer, more efficient way. So for us as a company, I mean, this is really what we're about. Like we want to make the world a better place using autonomous drone technology. And I think this is still very early. It's a new category of device that's still kind of in its infancy.
Great. Yeah. So, what do Skydio is obviously a clear leader in autonomous flight. What do you have that other companies haven't really been able to solve for? What sort of sets you apart and allows you to, hold that leader position?
So the product and the technology is really just a direct reflection of the team of people that's working on it. And I think really what sets us apart, in a lot of cases with drones, the concepts have been relatively easy to imagine. This idea of a drone that follows you around and takes cool video, that concept is pretty easy to imagine. A lot of people have thought about it or marketed it. But I think what sets us apart as a company is that we've been able to really like buckle down and solve a lot of the core technology challenges that are necessary to make these things come to life. And our ability to do that is a reflection of the group of people that we're having. We're fortunate to just have an amazing group of folks on hardware and software, and now operations, manufacturing, marketing, sales, everything that it takes to make these things really happen and come to life. So I think that's far and away the number one factor. I think that by virtue of having a really good team, I think we've made some kind of core architectural bets on treating the device like a flying computer, investing very heavily in a very flexible software system that enables us to build up this functionality and rapidly advance capabilities. So I think there's a few factors like that are all coming together.
And what do you see as your next steps? I've heard you say in interviews before that in some applications, like a human pilot, the most pro pilots might actually, in some ways, sort of beat the drone or do certain things better. So, yeah, what's the state of things in autonomous flight, and sort of what's the path forward from here?
So our overall outlook on the industry, I think, is informed by how early we believe it is. This is a big part of what motivated us to start the company. But if you look at the way that drones are used today, how they're used, where they're used, there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening, and they're becoming more and more standard in industries like construction, energy, public safety. So there's real use happening, and they're helping people do their jobs better. But it's still, I think, just a fraction of what's ultimately possible. And I think there's a regulatory component to that. There's also just kind of a customer adoption and societal acceptance element. But I think there's also a lot of product pieces as well. So we're most focused on the autonomy piece because we think that's kind of the biggest lever. It's sort of what pushes drones into the software regime. And I think an analogy that none of these analogies are perfect, but I think another way to think about this is kind of the transition in the early days of the PC industry from these kind of hobbyist hacker devices that the most dedicated, enthusiastic people could get value out of, but you had to really learn how to program the device before you could do something useful with it, to the graphical user interface with Microsoft Windows and the Mac, which turned the PC into like a really software-defined thing with a huge wealth of applications that span a lot of different industries and users. And I think that's what we believe autonomy does for drones. It turns it into a software-defined experience where if you can write software that solves a particular problem, like say house inspection, that capability then becomes available to all your users out in the world whenever they want to use it. And I think we're still very early in that coming to fruition. So, for example, I mentioned roof inspection. Like we're working with Eagle View, which is a leader in the insurance claims processing space, rolling out a fully automated residential roof inspection product. And we're incredibly excited about that. But even within that industry, and as large as that deployment is, it's still single digit percentages of like covering that entire market. And that's just one use case. And that same thing exists for energy utilities, for transmission tower inspection, or for construction sites. So we've got a lot of work to do as a company to make the products and the tech good enough that it's robust to serve all these things, and then building out the capabilities that make all these use cases really sing the way that they should. And that's I think that's just sort of the story of technology. Like the easier these things become to use, like the more it just becomes you push a few buttons and the task gets completed, the broader adoption is, and then the more interesting stuff gets built on top of that.
Okay, and you're actually touching on another one of my questions. So what do you see as the biggest bottleneck or sort of focus area to enable adoption? Is it regulation? Is it improvements in the technology for these specific applications? Is it education on the customer side?
So I'm probably biased, and I think we tend to look at things more through a product and technology lens because that's the stuff that we have the most control over. But I think that's where there's the most work to do. I think that regulation has sometimes been a punching bag for the industry. Of companies will say like, oh, we could be doing all this amazing stuff if regulators weren't holding us down. And certainly there are areas where it would be nice if certain things were allowed, but by and large, I think the regulation that's out there today is reasonable given, a world where you have manually flown drones and where you need an expert pilot there to fly it. And I think it's on us as an industry to get the technology to the point where that's not the case, and then demonstrate the value that it has for customers and the safety case around it. And when that's happened, I think you see regulators responding to that. So, for example, we worked with the FAA and the North Carolina Department of Transportation to get a first of its kind waiver for beyond visual line of sight flight that spans the entire state of North Carolina for bridge inspection. And we were able to get that because we were able to show that, when our drones are flying themselves based on computer vision in close proximity to bridges, they don't pose any risk to manned aircraft because they're so close to the structure. And there's steps that we can take to make sure that everybody on the ground is safe. And beyond visual line of sight flight is this thing that's been sort of talked about as like the FAA needs to open this up in order for the industry to move forward. But I think that's a case where, we were able to show the product and tech was there. There's a customer using it. And, we got the approvals we need for the customer to do what they need to do. So I think it's really, my perspective, I think it's on us as an industry to build the products and the tech that make these things incredibly valuable to customers, such that they're they're banging down to the door to get it and telling regulators that, hey, we need this unlocked. And when we've seen those pieces come together, I think we've seen reasonable regulation fall into place. So I think the next wave in terms of, where the products and the technology need to go, I think the next wave is really around persistent internet connectivity for the drone itself, providing massive leverage for the operators, where you can have drones that live in boxes that are connected to the internet that fly themselves whenever they need to, and a single operator can deploy 1 or 10 or hundreds of drones to go off and perform a particular task or set of tasks with huge leverage, and then the data all flows seamlessly back up to the cloud. I think to me, that's the future of the industry. And you can look at a lot of what we're doing now is laying the building blocks and the foundations to enable that future to come to life.
Interesting. And so for that communication piece, is that, would you want sort of more infrastructure to be built out to help with that connectivity? Or is this, again, sort of more on the product development side that you're thinking of things?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, most of the developed world has pretty good 4G coverage. And I think that's a sufficient starting point for a lot of this to exist. And that's the way that's what we're doing, is working within the existing infrastructure. I certainly think that, I generally view us, and I think drones, as a customer of this. Like there's a lot of folks working on, improving wireless internet connectivity around the world through 4G and then 5G and maybe beaming it down from satellites like Starlink. So there's a lot of investment happening there. And I think that's stuff that we'll naturally benefit from as an industry. But I don't think we depend on it to do a lot of useful stuff. I mean, even with the infrastructure that's already out there today, I think there's way more that can be done with drones.
Got it. And what do you see as the most exciting applications? I mean, you're working on inspection. Of course, Skydio drones are very good at cinematography. Are there any new markets that you think are opening up with drones that didn't exist before, and that people or analysts might not be sort of predicting that you see coming through?
Well, I think there's a pretty exciting wide set of applications out there. And I think that's one of the cool things for the industry, but also one of the challenges is there's just so much stuff. So we have customers doing all kinds of inspection tasks. We're working with a customer that does indoor warehouse inventory monitoring with our drones, where they fly up and down the aisles of warehouses. And there's a pretty exciting wide set of stuff already out there, I think, with people thinking about it. So to me, the frontier is not necessarily new applications. I think the frontier is really like making the things that you can see sort of working today with the most forward-leading customers that are willing to invest a lot of time and money to standing up their programs, to working extremely well with very little friction, such that they can really be rolled out at scale. So one example where I see the most potential for positive impact, and I think this is also one that carries with it some controversy, but I have a pretty strong perspective on, is this notion of a drone as first responder. We call, like, the acronym we use internally is DFR. where you can basically send a drone to the scene of a 911 call to get real-time situational awareness in a matter of seconds rather than minutes or tens of minutes for somebody to get there on the ground. And I think that this is something to me that I think has the potential to really transform policing for the better. Where you imagine if you're at a 911 call where a crime's being committed, like being able to have a drone there to capture what's happening, provide information to the 911 operator, I think is one, just going to be like a really powerful crime prevention tool, but it's also going to be a life-saving thing, like equipping officers with the knowledge that the suspect is armed or they're not armed, or whatever the details of the situation are, such that they can respond appropriately. I think we'll keep communities safer, and allow police to do a better job. So that's something that I'm particularly excited about. I think it's also not controversy free. The idea of equipping police with drones that fly overhead and maybe can be abused to surveil cities proactively. It carries a lot of other things associated with it. And I think as an industry, as a company, it's stuff that we need to think about. But that's one example. But I think there's a lot of things out there like that where it's just a fundamental step change, where drones enable something to be done way safer and in a way more cost-effective way. Like for policing, the benchmark or something that you might compare against is the cost of a manned helicopter that costs $500 or $1,000 an hour of operation, is incredibly expensive and noisy and dangerous. Like when those things crash, they kill people, and so when you take that down and put it into something that costs a few $1,000s and flies itself, it's just a totally different use paradigm.
So that brings me to one of my other questions, which is, what sort of cost dynamics do you see here? In a lot of cases, we've seen autonomous technology can reduce the cost of a human-in-the-loop system by at least a tenth. But you just give a clear example of where that could be much higher. What do you sort of see broadly in different applications in terms of that cost reduction factor? How should we be thinking about that?
I mean, I think it varies. It varies quite a bit by application, but it's really significant, as you say. I mean, it's like a factor of 10 to 100 is if you're comparing against like a manned aircraft system, is oftentimes where you'll land. And that's a big enough change that I think it just changes the way things work fundamentally. Like there's all kinds of tasks where it wouldn't make any sense to send a manned helicopter out to look at it or do that task, that become no brainer to send a drone out to do it. So I think that's a really powerful factor for the industry.
And you also mentioned that forward-thinking customers, that are sort of willing to adopt drones and sort of want to integrate with the technology are an important piece of the puzzle. What do you see as the most forward-thinking companies, or maybe just industries, or even countries that are very accepting of drones? Sort of who's leading the way here?
We've seen a lot of forward-leaning customers in places where people might not typically expect to see forward-leaning customers. I mean, a lot of like the sort of oldest industries, the industries that operate, like the rail industry, or energy utilities, or police departments and fire departments. I think within each of those industries, we've been really fortunate and excited to find people and organizations that are really excited about new technology and see the potential and lean into it, and oftentimes organically find ways to deploy it. So a very common pattern that you'll see, especially with the drone programs that have been around the longest, is there was often a drone enthusiast who was kind of a hobbyist hacker who had a personal interest themselves, who had drones, and they started bringing them to work, and they started finding all these interesting, cool use cases for them. And that's oftentimes how these programs started. And then a lot of the companies will really lean into it once they see the potential. In terms of countries, so a few off the top of my head, like Japan has, I think, a really favorable outlook where they generally like lean into robots and like deploying robots to do useful tasks. There's also a lot of infrastructure in Japan. For a relatively small land area, they've got a huge number. They've got a lot of cell towers and energy distribution and bridges. And so we see a lot of exciting activity in Japan. I think Australia is another one where I think as a country, they've done a really good job leaning in, and they've got a regulatory framework to support that. Same thing in Japan. There's a lot of really interesting drone companies in Australia working on various pieces of the technology stack.
Great. And then during the pandemic, how do you think that's affected the adoption of this technology? I've heard you say that certainly on the manufacturing side, there's been some disruptions, but what have you seen in terms of, sort of from the demand pull side? What in the past year, what's been going on?
So I think from a demand and a pull perspective, I think COVID has, in many cases, like really highlighted how useful and how important drones can be, because it, fundamentally it provides more leverage for companies and for operators to get things done without needing to send huge teams of people out in the field to do a particular kind of, say, inspection task. And we've certainly seen that with our customers. It's not true across the board, but in most categories, we've seen interest and demand either stay constant or go up with coronavirus, which I think when you compare that to general economic pressure downwards, says a lot about the technology and the demand that's out there. So I think if anything, I would say the industry is likely to be positively impacted, but it certainly, we and our customers and everybody else, I think, just has increased friction in getting anything done because it's harder to travel. There's supply chain disruption and things like that. So I think we're dealing with that the same way that everybody else is.
Okay, and so I'm curious to get your thoughts. That we have in the drone space, there's some military companies that have moved into commercial applications, and Skydio started with more consumer applications, now moving towards the commercial side. How do you see players like yourself versus those military drone makers now, sort of perhaps competing in the same field?
Well, I like our position. I think that it's. I think you can see this in other categories. The pace of innovation and the pace of technology development that comes out of the kind of consumer enterprise high technology way of thinking is really, really hard to match. And I think you've seen that crossover happen in lots of places. There's obvious examples like Microsoft has a really significant government and defense business, basically selling products that were developed either for consumers or for enterprise customers into defense customers. And most soldiers now carry a government issued smartphone that was not designed from the ground up to be a soldier phone, but it's riding the backs of like massive investment in processors and cameras and operating systems for smartphones. It's a similar story in the cloud. The government at this point relies on we'll see. I don't know if that contract is settled, but between AWS and Azure is relying on cloud technology that was primarily developed for commercial enterprise users. And I think drones have a lot of the same dynamics where there's a lot of really advanced technology. AI is a huge component of it, and the fast product iteration cycles that companies that are playing in the consumer commercial world tend to operate on just get you to like a fundamentally better place in terms of cost, size, weight, performance. This has always been, it wasn't clear exactly when it was going to happen. This had always been kind of a big part of our vision and why we decided to start where we did with the kind of consumer product foundation. I think that the companies that are going the other direction know this. The companies that are more traditionally defense oriented, I think, recognize the kind of shift that's happening, and they're trying to adapt. They have some advantages by being kind of incumbents and having close relationships with all the customers and being on a lot of these kind of government programs of records. But I think you're going to see the best products come from the other direction.
Okay, and broadly, where do you see the industry going in the next 5 years? What do you expect to happen over that time?
Uh, so I think this is maybe not the most exciting answer, but I think it's a real one. I think that what you're going to see a lot of is things that are sort of working today with a few customers and companies work way better and reach many more customers. I think there's going to be some new applications, but I think that the basic story is going to be things that customers are the most enterprising customers are leaning forward and piecing together solutions now. I think um, those things will get integrated, they'll get more automated, and they'll be just way better functioning products that way more people can use and take advantage of. Uh, and then the other big shift, which I think is coming over that time frame, which is really part of the same story, is the shift towards the drone being internet connected and living in its own kind of box, charging dock home, so that drones really become infrastructure that's installed, and you can access it over the internet. It can fly itself on demand, or it can fly on a regular schedule, whatever it needs to do the kinds of like routine inspection, security, mapping type tasks that are required. And that's a really big deal because then the whole thing is really defined by software. You don't need an operator on the ground for a lot of these tasks. You can dispatch the drone through the internet. And the other misconception I'd point out here, I think some people sort of point at this as like, oh, it's eliminating the task of the drone operator, but really what it's doing is it's just making them way more effective. Where rather than having a one-to-one mapping with people in the field, you can have one person deploying like a huge fleet to just get way more done.
Okay. And then last question, what did I not ask you that you think our viewers should be looking out for next in the industry or with Skydio?
That's a good question. We covered a lot of ground. Um, the overall thing that I'd say is to not get too fixated on the way things are now, because I think people can kind of make the mistake of looking out and seeing what a drone is now and seeing how people use it and thinking that's the way it's always going to be. But I think we're still very early. Like comparing it again, I use the PC analogy. Like we're probably in the like early 80s of PCs, and if you look at everything that happened between like the Mac and the products really reach. I mean, arguably, like the smartphone is the continual evolution of the PC. Like the thing is still evolving. So I still think we've got a lot of pretty interesting and disruptive innovation cycles within drones, more and more from a software standpoint, but things that I think fundamentally change, like who uses them, how they use them, and what they're capable of.
Okay, great advice. There's disruptive innovation within disruptive innovation in a way happening here. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Adam. So great to speak with you, and I certainly learned a lot.
All right, thanks, Tasha.